Hi everyone, welcome to my stories. No voiceovers, no dialogues, just moments, and what they make you feel. Today's story begins with a quiet afternoon in the countryside. Tu Tieu, with her hands scarred from work, finishes building a simple water bridge. Alan returns, carrying a truth about the past, about Mrs. Lan, about the stolen money, about gratitude that lingers. Yuri arrives, and what was supposed to be an ordinary meal turns into a silent moment of connection. A subtle turning point no one expected. The morning was still, broken only by the faint thud of wood under Tu Tieu's hands. She bent low over the freshly dug holes, strands of damp hair clinging to her forehead. The first wooden pillar slid into place, its base sinking into the moist earth, the sound of packed soil sealing it firm and steady. Each shovelful was a measured heartbeat, careful yet unyielding. It felt as if she was pouring all her emptiness into building something solid, something that could hold against the fragile edges of the world. Nearby, Mrs. Lan watched, her face lined with quiet sorrow. Her gaze followed Tu Tieu's movements as if trying to hold on to a fleeting calm. Then, softly, like a brittle wind beneath the sun, she spoke of her daughter. She had to leave, to search for a distant shadow she could not ignore. A tension rippled through her hands, but her eyes were resolute, carrying a determination that silenced all doubt. Tu Tieu froze mid-motion, her gaze lowered, shadows deepening in her eyes. She understood that from this day, this yard would feel emptier, missing the presence of someone familiar. She nodded gently, sending the woman off with a look that held no promises yet carried a quiet hope that one day Mrs. Lan would return. A breeze swept past, coating the fresh pillar with a thin veil of golden dust. For a moment, Tu Tieu felt her hands tremble, not from exhaustion, but from the subtle ache of something slipping quietly from her heart. Egan's house was steeped in a heavy silence. He sat still, his gaze lowered, as if every hope had slipped away somewhere between the figures and contracts. The news from Truong Fat Company cut through his trust like a cold blade. He had transferred 25% of the project's funds, yet Director Tuan claimed no money had arrived. Doubts, rumors, and the harsh stares from Yuri and his mother pressed on Egan's shoulders like invisible weights. Across from him, a friend sat quietly, listening to his broken words, eyes filled with worry and sympathy. Questions about the accountant, the one who took the money and disappeared, only thickened the tension in the room. Egan's lips tightened as he twirled a pen between his fingers. His eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. Selling this house crossed his mind, but the thought of losing it felt like another blow he might not survive. A soft breeze drifted through the window, ruffling the contracts scattered on the table. The friend looked at him, speaking slowly about investigating Truong Fat. In Egan's eyes, a faint glimmer of light appeared, fragile yet real, like the last spark of faith. He lifted his head, taking a deep breath, saying nothing but silently promising himself that he would rise, fight, and uncover the truth no matter how dark the path ahead. After the conversation, the room sank into a silence broken only by the friend's quiet sigh. The worry for Egan lingered like a cold wind threading through every thought. She began her desperate journey to borrow money, a frantic cycle of pleas and fragile hope. Meeting an old friend yielded only 80 million Vietnamese dong, a meager sum compared to the immense amount needed. Even as the cash rested in her hands, the weight in her chest grew heavier, making it hard to breathe. Call after call followed until she finally dialed her mother. Her mother's voice wavered, a mix of concern and disbelief when hearing her request for 500 million Vietnamese dong. Yet love and trust prevailed. Her mother agreed. That simple yes on the other end of the line felt like a thin lifeline, fragile but enough to keep her moving. She closed her eyes, drew a deep breath, knowing this was only the beginning. Meanwhile, in another corner of the day, Tu Tieu pressed on with her water bridge project. Palm bark sheets were measured and cut with precision, each screw biting into the surface as if pinning her quiet resolve in place. The clang of metal, the thud of wood formed a steady, determined rhythm. This labor was not just physical effort, but also a way to anchor her restless mind, to create a breathing space amidst the storm of uncertainty. The afternoon tilted toward evening, sunlight slanting through the trees and spilling across the yard where Tu Tieu had just finished her water bridge. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, her hands smeared with dust and faint scratches, yet her eyes shimmered with quiet satisfaction. It was then that Alan appeared. His shadow stretched long over the ground, his slow steps carrying an unspoken weight. Alan's gaze lingered on the humble yet painstaking structure, and he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Then he spoke of Mrs. Lan, a truth that cut deep. She had taken his money and gold, but it was all stolen from her by robbers. Yet Alan bore no anger. Instead, he treated it as a token of gratitude, a price he was willing to pay for the life she had once saved. The words left Tu Tieu stunned, her heart stirring with a mix of guilt and admiration. Not wanting the moment to fade into silence, Alan shared his wish to cook a meal as a gesture of thanks. He smiled faintly, though the smile carried hesitation, like someone returning from a long journey, unsure of warmth. Tu Tieu hesitated for a breath, then nodded. Together, they planned to visit the market, buying what was needed. Alan reached out to Yuri, inviting him to join the meal. As twilight crept into the yard, Tu Tieu felt something unexpected rising within her. A sense of change, as though today would mark the beginning of a story she could not yet name. The late afternoon market bustled with life, golden light spilling like honey across the crowded stalls. Tu Tieu quietly picked through fresh corn, imagining Uri's smile when he tasted his favorite dish. Alan stood close by, holding the basket, his gaze tracing every careful motion she made. The distance between them felt both near and distant, as if a fragile thread was pulling them closer, knot by knot. Amid the chatter and footsteps, Alan unexpectedly crossed paths with an older man. Their eyes met, a flicker of surprise flashing between them. The man called Alan's name, his voice deep, worn, and unmistakably familiar. It was his father. The sudden reunion made Tu Tieu pause, watching the two like fragments of a long-lost memory colliding in the middle of an ordinary day. Alan's face softened, stirred by the encounter, but he gently promised to meet his father later. On their way back, they stopped by a clothing store. Alan tried to buy Tu Tieu some new outfits, but she declined with a quiet smile. They soon returned home, knowing the thank you meal awaited. Along the road, the evening breeze carried the mixed scents of the market. Warm, earthy, and oddly comforting. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a friend was still struggling to gather the money needed to help Egan. Even the 500 million borrowed from her mother wasn't enough, and the pressure gnawed at her like a shadow creeping in from all sides. In that moment of helplessness, a bold decision emerged: to apply for a position at Tuan Company, not just to work, but to uncover the truth hidden behind the turmoil. Dusk settled, the pale golden light spreading across the small house where Tu Tieu had locked the door and gone out. Alan arrived, standing still before the newly built water bridge, his eyes tracing every detail as if reading the story of her tireless work. He bent down to wash the water jar, filling it to the brim, feeling the coolness flow over his hands, a quiet act of sharing. When Yuri arrived, the atmosphere warmed. The three stepped into the modest kitchen where simple utensils were neatly arranged. Alan carefully prepared the ingredients, the sound of the knife against the cutting board echoing like a calm rhythm. Tu Tieu stood nearby, washing vegetables while observing his movements, her head tilting slightly, her gaze softening as if she could see the real Alan, unpretentious, sincere. Yuri sat near the doorway, his deep eyes watching Alan with a blend of curiosity and quiet respect. This simple gesture, a thank you meal, stirred thoughts deep in Tu Tieu's heart. She recalled the days when Alan had been left stranded, robbed of his possessions, yet still carried gratitude within him. In the kitchen, the crackle of fire mingled with the gentle boil of water. The aroma of boiled corn and fried fish filled the air. The three of them exchanged glances, silent but laden with a subtle connection. This meal was more than an expression of thanks. It felt like the start of something unspoken, something quietly binding them together. Night fell, and the soft glow of the kitchen lights cast a warm, golden hue over everything, as if wrapping the scene in quiet peace. Tu Tieu arranged the table, the dishes simple yet filled with heartfelt care. Alan carried the plate of fried fish to the center, its rich aroma spreading like an unspoken memory, like gratitude taking shape. Yuri sat nearby, his gaze steady and contemplative, sensing the unspoken effort behind every gesture. No one said much in that moment. Silence became a delicate language of its own. Tu Tieu glanced at Alan, and in him she no longer saw a stranger, but a man marked by hardship, yet still holding on to sincerity. Tonight's meal was more than a gesture of thanks. It was a small turning point, a quiet beginning of connections and untold thoughts shared among the three of them. Outside, night spread across the village, and a soft breeze rustled through the leaves, like the whisper of time itself. Inside, the faint clinking of chopsticks and the gentle crackle of the kitchen fire formed a humble but moving melody. When the meal ended, Alan, Yuri, and Tu Tieu exchanged lingering looks, each holding on to their own thoughts, as if silently bracing themselves for whatever challenges lay ahead.